Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing our study of the essence of self-realization, the wisdom of Paramhansa Yogananda, recorded and compiled by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. We are up to chapter 11, and chapter 11 is called Grace versus Self-Effort, which is pretty darn important. This whole book, as we've been traveling through it, is really, well, it is exactly what it is. It's the essence of self-realization. So step by step, the law of karma, the nature of the path, every piece of it is, we're working through it little by little. So now we are up to grace versus self-effort. Master, at the time that he was living and teaching, he came to America in 1920, died in 1952, there were a lot of common issues that he had to work through a lot of time. And so one of the ones that he starts with immediately here is the basic, often touted Christian idea, because of what St. Paul said, by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of work, lest any man should boast. That was a letter that St. Paul wrote, and for many Christians that has become the principle that somehow or another salvation is something that just comes to us. Now, the origin of all this confusion in the Christian teaching is one of the many reasons why Master came to America and why Master was determined to resurrect and teach again the original teachings of Jesus. Because when Jesus became a unique Son of God, without any metaphysical understanding in the way that the Gita explains it, about what an avatar is, what a self-realized master is, how Jesus came to be born, because the Orthodox Christian dogma makes Jesus a unique creation. And we just declare that he was God's only son. Of course, those are the words that Jesus himself used, but the explanation of those words has been defined by Orthodox Christianity, and therefore we don't really have a very clear idea of what this is. From the Gita side, which is the side from which Master is teaching, of course, and which is why Babaji sent him to the West to teach from the New Testament and from the Gita, because of the tradition of India, in which we have a whole series of avatars. The avatar that is Jesus, we don't have anyone before or after, but in the Indian context, there's a whole series of avatars. So we understand what an avatar is, where he came from, why he was born, how he attained his self-realization, and all the rest of the teaching follows from that. In the Christian teaching, where we no longer have that Jesus was a soul who attained self-realization, and that we don't have a clear understanding of how the process of self-realization is attained, because Christianity itself no longer really has that concept, even though original Christianity has it, the teachings of Jesus have it, but Churchianity doesn't have it. So Jesus is just there. And so for us to understand how salvation is attained, we're also left equally helpless. I was raised Jewish, and because the Jewish people rejected the fact of Jesus being the Messiah, is what they call it in the Jewish tradition, which is an avatar, self-realized master, because they rejected not only Jesus, but in the process of rejecting him, they rejected the whole possibility of a human being attaining full mastery, divine mastery. And because the Christians in the churches have Jesus being a unique something that just happened, with no understanding of how he got there, and no understanding how the rest of us can get there, both of them, both traditions, lost the fundamental principles of spiritual life, which is that it is about our disciplined progression from ego identification to complete freedom from ego identification. And in my experience, Orthodox church-going Christians and Orthodox synagogue-attending Jews are equally lost in this fundamental way. There's always this kind of vague confusion about how this a final freedom is ever attained, if we're even seriously looking for that final freedom. Swamiji writes in other places that Hinduism, for all the imposition upon Hinduism of endless rituals and other things that cover over the purity of it, still alone among world religions holds the idea of moksha, of absolute freedom attainable by any individual, and for that reason has been the guru of the planet in keeping this essential teaching in place. So now where Master is talking about grace versus self-effort, that's how the Christian church often frames the debate. How much of it is just the grace of God, and how much depends on how we ourselves live. Now, there's another element that comes in here that is a little bit subtle, because you see, once we begin to transcend our identification with the ego, then our own sense of who we are and where power and where wisdom and where our very energy, inspiration comes from, what to speak of enlightenment, we simultaneously also begin to understand that the very nature of enlightenment does not spring from the ego, does not spring from that which I call myself. And so one experiences that enlightenment itself is the descent of grace, and that we don't do it of ourselves when the word I is referring to the ego. And this is where all of the confusion sets in. So the way Master really wants us first to understand is, he said, everything in life we have to work for. It's the nature of this planet. He said, if you want to become rich, you don't just sit in your room and expect, if you say, God, make me rich, it's just going to fall into your lap. Somebody's going to knock on your door and say that you've won the lottery, even though you haven't bought a lottery ticket. At the very least, you have to go buy a lottery ticket. And of course, most of the time you don't win anyway. But nonetheless, something has to be done. Some effort has to be done. In no area of our life do we imagine that it can come without any participation on our part. There's in one of the Jane Austen novels, Pride and Prejudice, there's this very proud woman who's comic in her pride and almost self-mocking in her pride, and she's very condescending to everyone. And the woman that she considers to be the rival to her daughter for the hand of the desirable bachelor is a very good pianist. And she says about herself, she says, well, yes, I could have been a very good pianist too if I had ever learned to play. It just sort of, it epitomizes the idea. Of course, we could all be very good at anything if we put out the effort to do it. But to call ourselves that without ever learning to play, it's ludicrous. So why would we think that on the spiritual level it's the same way, that we just kind of randomly get saved merely because we want to, or merely because we believe that we should? And Master makes a really strong point, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but and he also talks about the false idea that if you belong to the right group, if you're a member of the right church, if you sit in the right building on Sunday mornings, Garrison Keillor, who's an American humorist, who sometimes in his humor has a lot of wisdom, he remarked once, he said that thinking that you can that sitting in church will automatically make you a Christian, he said, is like sitting in your garage and expecting that you will become an automobile. And it just sort of sums it up, really. But of course, the churches can self-define. Religious groups can declare their dogmas and then tell you that this is what's going to happen, but merely because they say so. There's a cartoon that was very amusing, and it was the pearly gates, you know, the traditional pearly gates on the clouds. And there's a line of newly arrived souls into heaven, and they're going to go through the pearly gates, and there's two pearly gates, actually. And St. Peter, who's the traditional keeper of the pearly gates, is talking to some other angel there. And over the gate, one of the pearly gates, it says, the right religion. And over the other pearly gate, it says, the other religions. And the line comes up, and then you split, and you go into the right religion or the other religion. And as soon as you're on the other side of the pearly gates, the line merge again, and you go just straight forward to the same place. And Peter says to the angel, we've been doing it like this for millennia, and they just don't catch on. So it's just, I don't mean to mock people's sincere beliefs, but I guess I do mean to mock them. You know, there's a factor here where common sense also has to be part of the equation. This isn't just wishful thinking. See, this is the fabulous beauty of self-realization, which is why it's called the essence of self-realization. We don't have to put our minds on hold. If something seems a little fishy, self-realization will take you to a much sounder principle. And what's so beautiful about it is that it doesn't undermine this wonderful devotional understanding that truly, in the end, it is all the grace of God. That self-realization, as Master brought it, as Swamiji has explained it, it's like the reasonable, the sensible, the common sense, and the ethereal, and the sublime beauty of the power and love of God. They actually marry. They actually marry perfectly. And this was Master's mission. The power of the New Testament, the power of the Bhagavad Gita, the original teachings of Krishna, the original teachings of Jesus, and how they really take us through two gates to the same line into the state of true self-realization, not merely through the pearly gates into the choir of angels, but even as we live here on this planet, into that state of freedom and bliss, which is what happens to us when true self-realization comes and the ego is forgotten. Master also addresses the issue which some people raise, that sometimes when you look just at this world and try to understand it, you really can't always understand what God has in mind, why this one is saved and that one isn't. Especially when you read, for example, stories of, let's say, the apparition of the Virgin Mary, which has come to certain children at different times. In Medjugorje, Yugoslavia, not too long ago, a group of children were privileged very often to see the coming of the Virgin Mary and to hear her speak and to be completely transformed by this divine presence, and many healings and many great uplifting experiences would come. There was a little girl who lived, she's now a grown woman, in fact the mother of her own child, but when she was a little girl about 8 or 9 years old, she had has still a very spiritual nature, and her mother encouraged the spirituality of herself and her brothers with a lot of stories about saints and holy people and fables about spiritual things. And of course, any story of religious experience that involved children was especially interesting to them as children. And both in Fatima and also in Lourdes, the visionaries were very young children. And in both cases also, they were simple people who gathering wood in the forest or tending the sheep out in the fields. And so this little girl, about the age of 8 or 9, sort of calculated that her life ambition, this is true, her life ambition was to have a vision of the Virgin Mary. And she listened to these stories, and she saw that it was quite obvious that education was really not necessary and not particularly an aid. So she decided that she wanted to be a shepherdess, because she thought that would increase her chances of the Virgin Mary appearing to her. And it took some doing on the part of her parents to persuade her that the Virgin Mary would come whether she went to school or not, and so on like that. But this is how the child's mind works. But even the adult mind, why these children? Now, subsequently, in all cases, the profound spirituality, even of these children, became manifest by their attitudes and their selflessness and their divine love. They're beautiful stories, all of them. In the case of the Fatima appearances. Two of the children died young, but the third, whose name was Lucia, she lived joined a convent and lived many decades afterwards. And there's a book, and I presume you can find it. It's called Fatima in Her Own Words by Lucia. And it's an absolutely beautiful story of the whole apparition of the Virgin Mary. And there's a novel about Bernadette, since we're talking about these things, Song of Bernadette, it's called, and then a beautiful movie was made from it. There have been subsequent movies, which I can't vouch for, but the Song of Bernadette that must have been made to the 30s and the 40s, it's a black and white film. Very, very deeply moving. But the point is, from the outsider's point of view, in these stories and in many others, it's confusing. Who are these children? Why would they have these visions? Therese Neumann, as a young woman, having visions of Jesus being crucified and living through his death and resurrection once a week for many years of her life. Master writes about her in his autobiography of a yogi. From our point of view, we don't understand. These visitations of grace may seem arbitrary, but what we have to understand is God knows much more than we do. And of course, especially in the Christian tradition, these visitations seem arbitrary because Christianity has expunged from the original teachings of Jesus the concept of reincarnation. Reincarnation was part of Jesus' teachings, but some hundreds of years after his passing, those references were deliberately removed from the scriptures because the church, the Catholic Church being the only one at that time, decided it would be better for people. They would try harder if they had only this one incarnation. There's a few fragments of it left when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you think I am?" And they name prophets of the past, reincarnated now. And Jesus refers to John the Baptist as being a reincarnation of an ancient prophet. Jesus himself refers to that. So a few references snuck in there, but most of the references were removed because this is all part of the same teaching. Without reincarnation, the idea of self-realization doesn't work. I mean, look at it. In one incarnation, how much progress can a person make? If you see a person become free in one incarnation, you're looking at the end of many, many, many incarnations that have come before. You're not looking at somebody who just happened to be able to sprint much faster than someone else. So what appears to us from our limited memory and limited sight, and we've talked about reincarnation in previous of these sessions, what looks to us as an arbitrary whim of God is not arbitrary at all. It's this tremendous effort has been put into place, and a person is born at a level of realization. This is what the Bhagavad Gita gives us, you see. The Gita tells us that if you make a sincere effort, because Arjuna raises this question, Arjuna says to Krishna, what if I make an all-out effort to realize God in this incarnation, but I don't make it? I turn my back on worldly satisfaction, but at the end of life, on the worldly way of life, but at the end of life I don't have God either. Have I just wasted my time? And Arjuna says, Krishna answers him, no, of course not. He said, you reincarnate at whatever level of realization you have attained, which accounts for everything. I mean, not just spiritual realization, but everything. I'm so delighted these days by the internet because in this respect, because we have so many astonishing examples of young children who have amazing talents that are simply not comprehensible given the short span of life that they have. Mostly they still appear like children, although there have been some remarkable exceptions when it comes to singing. Some woman, a girl, I believe in Holland, has a fully mature female operatic voice. And without any lessons, she just listened to recordings and just come right back with that voice. She doesn't even sound like a child. She sounds like a mature woman. You can just see her in her last life. I've worked so hard to get this. I'm not going to waste all those years getting to this point again. And somehow or another, by her willpower and by the grace of God, she just held it. She was born with it again. So at 8 or 9 years old, She also said, which I love, she imagines herself standing on a balcony and just having all her fans in front of her, which is most certainly a memory of whoever she was. When she died, she just so deeply identified with that persona that she was able to carry it forward. Mozart is another example, and lots of other people who have remarkable talents from a young age. They're just carried over, the accomplishments of the past. And so when God's grace seems arbitrary, it's not arbitrary at all. It's the result of enormous amount of effort, just continuing on to the next incarnation. But nonetheless, when we start thinking about God's grace, because God's grace is part of it, because you see, that's how we overcome the ego, as Master puts it. We attune ourselves. Let me stop for a moment. Master writes in Autobiography of a Yogi, well, there's many sentences in there that could be held up as the single most important sentence in the book. But one of them that is really profound in its implications is thoughts are not individual. The thoughts that we have do not originate with ourselves or any individual has them. They are universal. And what we experience within our own consciousness is not generated by our individuality, but we attune ourselves and then we receive inspiration, thoughts, creative ideas from whatever vibration of consciousness we have attuned ourselves to. This is true on a low level, but it also progressively, until we're attuned ourselves to the highest level of divine vibration. And the experience that we call grace, and this is where self-effort comes into it, is the effort that we put forward is the effort to attune ourselves, to put ourselves on the wavelength where we are receiving not the affirmation of our egoic separateness, but the vibrations of divine consciousness. And you can't, God is not, as Master said, some sort of persona up there with a cosmic ego that is related to, in the same way that human beings are related to, praise and flattery and lots of money or promises to write his name on a big edifice. Those are all the projection of our little ego consciousness in which we think that God is just like us, only bigger and more powerful. That was the Kali Yuga way of thinking about it. What the divine truly is this infinite expansion of bliss, this perfect experience, Satchidananda, is what Master calls it, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new joy. The opposite of that, you see, is our ego self-definition, in which we are a limited body, which we are insecure in countless ways, which we see ourselves separate from all of reality. We are subject to death. But that is just a vibration of consciousness that we have chosen to attune ourselves to. And the self-effort required that brings us the grace is the disciplining of that wrong inclination and the directing of our energy upward, upward in the sense of expansive, and literally upward, drawing energy up the spine, until we are attuned with that more subtle vibration. And all the energy that we express is really the same energy, whether we express it dark or we express it in an elevated way. It's just what vibration we choose to attune ourselves to, whether we act to affirm the ego or whether we act to transcend the ego. And as I was saying, the effort required, and this is where in subsequent chapters we begin to touch on this, the chapter after this one is the need for yoga. Because once we understand the relationship between grace and self-effort, yoga is the method that we use in order to attune ourselves to that grace. Now we've had a question, so let's stop for a minute and see what that question is.
Our what are things I can do to strengthen my faith in God and Gurus, aside from meditation, prayer, affirmation, taking classes?
What else can I do to strengthen my relationship to God and Guru aside from meditation, prayer, affirmations, taking classes, having satsang? I think you probably covered it. But to be serious, but all those things are part of it. I get a lot of questions that it's taken me a long time to understand what the underlying question is. And I don't know who submitted that question, so I'm not going to be personal about this. I say that I don't know who gave me that question. So I may be talking to you, I may not. But I'm asked a question in many, many, many convoluted ways. And the question behind, however it's phrased, is, isn't there a shortcut? Isn't there some other way to get there? I don't think so. I have a principle that I arrived at slowly, which I find very helpful to me, and perhaps it's also helpful to you. I used to be at war with myself, and I used to be very insulting toward myself. That would be the way I would put it. And I called all my own wrong attitudes stupid. And I often have people talking to me, and they'll say, well, I know it's stupid to feel this way. Or, I know I really shouldn't feel this way. Or you make a suggestion, I know, that's what I ought to do. No, actually, it's not stupid, and we don't know. It takes many incarnations to be as committed to wrong attitudes as we presently are. We've worked really a long time to build up this commitment to the egoic self. And in a sense, that effort has not been wasted, because before you can even begin to think about surrendering your limited consciousness into the infinite consciousness, you have to have a certain self-possession. In other words, you can't give away what you don't own. If I wanted to make a very generous gift to God and I reached into your wallet and emptied it into the collection plate, it's really not going to be much of a gift for me. I have to give what I possess. I can't just take something that isn't mine and give it away. And a lot of times, we have to understand that the progression toward self-realization is that we have to have developed a lot of what you can only call egoic power. Because until we have that personal strength and that personal awareness and some command over ourselves, we don't own ourselves enough to give ourselves to God. Now understand that in the right way, but by the time we're thinking that maybe the ego is not the answer, it's because we've explored pretty deeply what the ego has to offer us. So that's why I'm saying all that effort is not completely wasted. It's what brings us to the point where we can say, this isn't working so well for me. Sometimes people try to skip that step, but it really doesn't take you anywhere. So now, however, we've seen the limitations of the ego. And we realize that now identification with that limited self does not serve us. And in several of the previous weeks, I've talked about the wave in the ocean and all of that. So we have a background there. So now we have to put out as much energy to transcend these attitudes as we have put in to build them. And it's not at all stupid. It's very, those attitudes are very well developed and very subtle. And it's not at all foolish or stupid of us to hold on to them. They've served us well up until now, but now they need to be let go. But the self-effort required is significant. And we're not going to generate it within ourselves merely by constantly putting ourselves down, because then we just declare the attitude stupid and think we're done with it. No, we've been quite committed to this attitude for a really long time, and we have to confront it with tremendous strength, but you have to, the way I put it, you have to respect your enemy. And delusion is your enemy, and it's a formidable enemy, and cannot be dismissed, and cannot just be said, I know, I know, I know. No, we don't know. And no, there is no shortcut. We just have to persevere, one foot in front of the other. Now, the wonderful thing about this path is summarized by Krishna's remark, even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. So it's not an all or nothing situation. It's not like it's total misery and then sudden bliss. It's the deeper we get on the path, the more attuned we get, the more of Satchidananda we begin to perceive, the more grace we experience, the more grace we experience. And that's the way it works for us. But the one thing I will say here is that we can conscientiously and consciously build our faith in God. And Master gives us in this particular chapter a few very simple ideas. He makes a distinction here between belief and faith. Belief, he says, is what inspires us to try the experiment. If we didn't believe self-realization were possible, if we didn't believe that that greater happiness would come to us from following the path and trying to transcend the ego than just indulging the ego, we wouldn't even start. And we all know people in our lives who they're just not interested. Their experience of life just doesn't take them to think they ought to be thinking in a different way. At the end of her life, an aged friend of mine, when I asked her how she thought about death, she was not someone who's on the spiritual path, but I asked her, what do you think about death? Are you afraid? Are you looking forward to it? And she said, I just hate to think of all this going on and my not being here to be part of it. And it was just, she was in the last year or two of her life, and that was still her thinking, that this world was where it was at, and she just wanted to stay a part of it. There was no thought of transcending or letting go. And another friend, acquaintance, heard about reincarnation with having no context whatsoever, and she came to a devotee friend who she knew was into this stuff. Guess what? She said, we get to come back. And that's just so the opposite of the way the yogi thinks. The yogi thinks, I just want to transcend this level of consciousness and go on to a higher one. But from her perception, it was a great lark to be here, and she just wanted to come back as often as she could. And so they don't even have the belief that it would be nice to transcend the ego, that the ego is really the source of suffering, and I wish to identify with the divine and not with the finite. The belief isn't even there. So somewhere it has to enter your consciousness, and this is very intuitive. Swamiji says, Master says elsewhere, it's very interesting. He says, someone in a different piece of writing, he says that we don't really learn these teachings, we just recognize them. And we recognize the articulation of our own experience. And until our own experiences matches what's being articulated, it doesn't make any sense to us. There's no vibration where the two can meet. So somewhere a belief enters our mind that this life, this being born, growing up, getting married, having children, getting a job, making my house, all of these things that we do, it enters our mind that there's got to be more to life than this. Some of us were born with that realization. I remember as a small child, well, I was 10 actually, there was a picture window in our house, and I stood on the suburban street, and I stood at our house, and I looked across the street there, and I looked over to the house just to the left across the street. Man was mowing his lawn, and I watched him for some time mowing his lawn, and all that it represented, the house that he had, the pride that he took in it, the responsibility to his wife, the mowing of the lawn, just everything. And I just stared with such intensity out that window, and I kept thinking, and of course this is my articulation now, I kept thinking that if I stared at it long enough, the delusion would part, that I could feel that there was a deeper reality behind it. Now I think of Maya, that I wanted Maya to part and show me reality. And I just stared and stared with all my intensity, and I just wanted that whole illusion of ordinary life to part because I knew there was something behind it. Nobody told me anything about it or talked to me, but it was already part of my vibration. And I was so, really, the word is confused, because nobody was talking to me about it. It was 8 more years before the book came into my hand, and 12 more years before I met Swami Kriyananda. And then they started talking to me about it. But belief then was that it was possible to transcend the ego. And certain words were told to me, about the practice of yoga, the practice of meditation, all of these things, and I believed it to be true. In previous lives, I'm certain I experienced it to be true, but the belief that it was true motivated me to try the experiment. And that's how Master said belief is beneficial, because if you don't believe it's true, you won't try the experiment. When Edison wanted to make the electric light bulb, he deeply believed that there was a filament that would make it work. And was it 20,000 different things he tried before he found the one that actually worked? I think it was at least that, some wildly large number. And everyone around him was telling him not to do it, that it wasn't going to work, but he knew it would work. So he just kept doing the experiment. I heard an interview with whoever the scientist was who decided that you could make the chart of the human DNA. And apparently this man decided that it could be done, and everybody mocked him and made fun of him. And it took him some years, but he succeeded in doing it. And the interviewer asked him, he said, "How did you feel when everybody was mocking you for the folly of what you were doing?" And the man said, "It had absolutely no effect on me." He said, "I knew it could be done." And that is when belief causes you to go forward, and then your belief is proven. Your faith proves true. But if you don't have that belief when you start, then you're not going to try hard enough. But once you begin to practice what you believe, assuming your belief is valid, then you begin to have experiences. And once those experiences begin to come, then your belief is no longer mere belief, it becomes faith. I mean, these are, to a certain extent, an arbitrary distinction, but it's a very important one, because there is a point when your spiritual life doesn't matter. It's not about dogma, it's not about belief, it's about what you have experienced. And that is the answer to the question. You must build your spiritual life on the basis of your own experience. And you can read things that are beyond your experience, and you can believe that they're true. And you can take what those people who tell you those are as the route to get there, and you can believe it's true, and then you'll follow the experiment. When Master writes in Autobiography of a Yogi about the tremendous efficacy of Kriya, how it cuts so much time off of your incarnational cycle, that one Kriya, which takes a minute or so to do, is the equivalent of 1 year of right living without the danger of incurring more karma as you try to work out what you already have, is the airplane route to God, as Master calls it. And if you're holding autobiography in your hand and you feel the vibration of truth that's there, you may have no way of knowing, no way of truly knowing from your own experience that one Kriya will take a year off your life, but you can deeply believe it. And then you start the process of becoming initiated into Kriya, and then you start the ongoing practice of Kriya. And Kriya begins to open the door to this realm of experience of a reality beyond the ego. And then you go back and you read what the masters say, and even if you haven't experienced it all, you've experienced some of it. And then, oh, that's right, now I know what that means. All of us have had the experience of reading and rereading, whether it's the Bible or the Gita or books that Swami Kriyananda has written or Master has written or Sister Gyanamata's letters to her disciples in the book God Alone, or re-listening to classes or lectures that Swamiji and others have given. And you know that I know that I was there. I know that I heard it. And then I hear something there that I never understood before, because my own experience now allows me to hear it. And I couldn't have understood it before. I believed him. But now, because my experience has risen, now I have faith. Now I absolutely know. And nothing can take it away from you. It's not a matter of somebody being able to talk you out of it. It would be like trying to talk you out of the fact that this is your right arm and this is your left. It's just the way I'm made. And this is what gives persecuted holy people the courage to just be killed before they'll repudiate it. How can I repudiate it? It just is who and what I am. Or do heroic, sacrificial things that appear sacrificial to others that aren't even an inconvenience, barely, because this is just the way I am made. How could I behave otherwise? You're not acting on belief then. Faith gives you that power. And Master says, he says, and it's very important, that much in our lives would give us faith if we just turned our attention and began to orient our thinking in that direction. I mean, we have habits of the mind that either are to negate and negate and negate and to doubt, or to see really the miracle of everything all around us. It's the way God plays in our life is absolutely constant. Master says it so sweetly in another place. God answers so many prayers and people don't realize that the prayers have been answered. They just think something has happened. But we're not turning our attention. We're not attuning ourselves to that higher vibration. We're not consciously trying to see behind the vibrations of this ordinary world the deeper vibrations of spirit. And much of what we don't see is not because it isn't obvious, but it hasn't occurred to us to look. We let our minds dwell on worry and on self-concern and doubt and anxiety, and meanwhile the angels are whispering to us constantly, even in the natural world, and especially in the natural world. Read Master's Whispers from Eternity. So many of his whispers are a beautiful exposition on taking what we see all around us and turning it into a symphony of divine expression, be it flowers or wind or rain or the stars in the sky or the bustling of city traffic, whatever it might be. Master, in those poems, those poem prayers, is teaching us how to have the right attitude about everything that we see. And the no shortcut route to God is to use every minute that you're able to use, every minute that you can lift above the mundane to perceive the divine is one more movement of energy to make that ego transcending reality your own. It's so marvelous to realize how completely mutable. We think of ourselves as a fixed entity. We're not a fixed entity at all. We're a vibration. And that vibration was created by the repetition of certain ways of living. And that vibration can be shifted by simply beginning to live in a new way. As Master said, the only difference between a saint and a person of very bad character is the way they behave. That the fundamental material is just the same. But a person of low consciousness behaves badly from the point of view of the divine, and a saintly person behaves in a very elevated way. And all we have to do is to begin to behave in the way that the saints behave, in the way they teach us to behave. And all of a sudden we find we are tuning ourselves to this divine vibration. And one of the things that Master says is We have to pray to God and ask Him to help us in the ways that are consistent with God's will for us, if we can understand that. He says if we're always just praying for material things and the desires of the ego and so on like that, there's no divine purpose in fulfilling those. What we really have to pray for is, as Master puts, the perfect prayer. The perfect prayer for this age of Dwapara is simply this: I will reason, I will act, I will, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to the right path in everything. Because this is the combination of self-effort and grace, that God will act through us if we ask Him to, and if we are open to where He wants to take us, and not merely trying to impose on the divine the ego's idea of what is best for us. Those are the prayers that they don't get answered because there is no divine answer for such prayers. And what Master also emphasizes with great importance is the simple concept of common sense. Saint Teresa of Avila founded several dozen convents in the time that she lived. And at that time, the nuns lived cloistered, and the convents were 12 women. And they entered into the cloister, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives. And so Saint Teresa, in advising the mothers of each of these convents who were going to establish the convents, she said, great care must be exercised in the selection of this family of nuns, because you will be together for a whole lifetime, often. And she said, above all, she said, look, when you're evaluating the would-be nuns, look for common sense. She says, even devotion can be learned, but common sense has to be inherent. And Master emphasizes with several examples of people just behaving in a reckless manner and claiming that God will take care of them. First of all, there's this balance point, which is an important balance point, between faith and what Master calls presumption. Just presuming on God's will and God's protection when you really haven't built your experience of that step by step. There's a terrible story told that is supposedly true about two children, I think they were, who decided they wanted to prove God's power, and they went out into the forest, and one of them picked up a machete and said, I'll cut off your head, but God will save you. And he cut off the head, and God didn't save him. And Master said afterwards, why should he? Such foolishness to no purpose. He said it's not as if God is like like someone who, just like some person who's going to show his power just to show off. And there's a story Master tells of women who never locked their car, even if valuable things were in it, saying that God would protect them. And again, Master said, why should he? The lock on the car is there to protect bad people from temptation. And then ultimately the women lost much that was of great value to them. Master said, it's just presumption. Why would God protect you when you are perfectly capable of protecting yourself in that situation? And Master says also the power of faith that can work miracles is the power of self-realization. Jesus could raise the dead. Jesus could walk on water. He could turn water into wine because he was attuned. His ego, his self-awareness had expanded to the point where he could perceive the divine presence behind ordinary reality. So when he prayed for that to happen, or for the sick to walk, he could see the divine reality. He was living at the level where he could make that declaration, and it was his actual experience. And so it happens, that's why it says in the Bible, whatsoever ye pray, believing, that will happen. But that belief can't be just an affirmation, or as Master said, wishful thinking. There has to be this feeling of power also there. How do you know that?
Well, it's an experience. That's the only word one can use. Just like that scientist who was going to chart out the DNA, he just knew it. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't an affirmation. It wasn't a wish. Intuitively, he knew it. Thomas Edison, intuitively, he knew it. And as you progress on the spiritual path, you will have experiences. You will have moments when you simply know. I was once engaged in a very, it was a controversial project. Some people thought that the risk was worth it for the benefit of the result. Other people thought that the risk wasn't worth it. I happened to be spearheading those who believed that the risk was worth it and it would work out. I'm talking to Swami Kriyananda on the phone, and he's expressing concern that maybe things are not going to work out as well as we would want them to work out. And I just said to Swamiji, Swamiji, I rarely claim this, but the way the inspiration to do this came to me, when it comes like that, I know it's going to work. And it was very interesting. Swami said, okay then. He immediately understood what I was saying, because I rarely claim that. I mean, I can probably list on one hand the times when I've known it, that certainly. But when you know it from experience, that certainly, you know that if you put out the effort, and if you pray and attune yourself as you go, then it will happen. And we work with common sense. It's even if I know from intuition that this is meant to happen, that doesn't mean that I can skip all the intervening steps. It's not going to manifest if I don't put any energy behind it, but then I will reason, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to the right course in everything. And going from that initial inspiration and then holding that inspiration all the way through, charting a course like this, inspiration can also be squandered. And ego can interfere. And this is the marriage of grace and self-effort. Even true intuition can be given to you. On the previous occasion, in fact, I had a true intuition. I just knew what was supposed to happen. But I became very careless in my expression of that intuition. And I allowed the intuition to go to my ego. And in doing so, instead of working harmoniously with others, I antagonized many people until I realized that whatever true intuition I had received, I had now conceivably blocked it and certainly muddied it by not reasoning and acting in accordance with divine will. So in that particular situation, I pulled back. I wrote a letter to everyone involved and said, whatever intuition I have had, true or false, I've now muddied the waters to such an extent that I'm going to withdraw. And I completely withdrew from the discussion. A number of months passed, and eventually everyone came exactly to where my first intuition was. And I don't say that with any pride, because I very nearly blew it. But there's still, it's not enough to be attuned once. And Swamiji, Master writes here very interestingly, all failure is due to a lack of attunement. And that's just a very interesting statement. And all failure is given to us so that we can then start over again and begin to say, okay, where did I go wrong? You know, how did I let wrong thinking or fears or impatience or this desperate desire for a shortcut to come into the story, and I didn't follow all the steps in the right way. You know, my first teaching about karma, even attunement actually, came when I was 10 years old, and my mother sent me to a woman with the wonderful name of Mrs. Taylor to learn how to sew. And in learning how to sew, I was just a child, and I was naturally more interested in the dress that I was going to get than in the process of doing it at the beginning. I learned very simply that you can't rush. And if you take a shortcut, later on it will just be a mess, and you'll have to tear it all back and go to the juncture in the road where you tried to do it without being sensitively attuned. You know, to the fabric, to the machine, to the design that you're working with. There's just, you can't cheat. And actually that childhood lesson has been really critical to my spiritual path. Every time I think I'm just going to find a shortcut, no, what will happen is that shortcut will create a knot, and then I'll get way past it, I think, and then everything will be funky at this point, and I'm just going to have to right back up and put this piece in order. And then you begin to understand what Master has often said, patience is the fastest route to God. It's just step by step, the patient application of willpower. That's the answer to the question. How do we attain God realization? By the patient application of willpower. We have one more question here at the end.
How do you best decipher when it's divine reality or grace at play, or our own desires? When do you receive a sign or answer?
Question is, how do you discern the difference between desire and grace? By experience. That's really the only way I can put it. These are theoretical questions that do not have theoretical answers. We need to be working. Let me think exactly how to say it. Because, this is what it's all about, but grace feels different than ego. That's the answer to it. And ego, you sort of begin to feel pride enters it, a little bit of puffed up. You're imagining how other people are going to feel. You're thinking about the great result that's going to happen and everyone's going to like you. Grace doesn't feel like that. Grace feels so calm, so impersonal, so relaxed. When it's been done by grace, you are enjoying it as much as everyone else with no sense of having done it yourself. Swamiji used to often come. He was so prodigiously creative, and he did so much work. I remember many a satsang where he'd come with a list of all the things that he'd done, wrote this book, did this music, had this lecture tour, did these radio shows, did these television shows like this. And he would just read off that list like a little child. And people who didn't understand would just think he was boasting. And he would do it so gleefully, and then he would say to his secretary, "Have I forgotten anything?" "Oh, yes, sir, you forgot this." And then he would add it on. But he was really showing us something completely different. Because then when others would ask him, "How do you accomplish so much?" "Oh," he said, "I lift my consciousness to the point between the eyebrows, and then I ask Master to give it to me." And then it's just there. And he just explained more deeply, "I will reason, I will act, but then guide thou my reason, will, and activity." And then he could present it as egolessly as a little child. Look at all that's been done. And it was never, even though he might say, "I wrote it," in the very vibration in which he would express it, he knew that he hadn't written it. And he was always encouraging us to be bold in our expectations and courageous in our efforts by lifting our attention to the point between the eyebrows and then asking Master to do it through us. "What would you have me do? I will reason, I will, but guide thou my will in everything." The only way you master this is by trying over and over and over again. Because you believe it's possible, then your experience shows you, and then you have faith that it can be done. God bless you.